All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to talk about a super important topic for cities, for NGOs, academics, and really anyone that's participating in technology, which is digital rights. I think as technology becomes more pervasive, I think we all agree that it's cities who are the stewards of residents' information and their privacy because they're the closest and they understand the issues that come with pervasive technology. But I also think it's important to recognize that it takes many more than just one organization to really tackle this really important topic, and it takes a collaborative effort. And so the really great thing is I have representatives from all walks of life who, in my opinion, are some of the brightest minds around digital rights. And so join me in welcoming our panelists. First, I want to introduce Pontus Westenberg, who is the Program Management Officer for UN Habitat. Malcolm Bain, he is a partner at Across Legal SLP. Sean Audane, City Innovation Lead from Wellington City Council. Mara Balastreni, who is the CEO for Ideas for Change. Mikko Rusama, the Chief Digital Officer for the City of Helsinki. And Emily Gerbaud, who is the Smart Cities Project Lead for the Department of Innovation and Economic Development for Grand Lyon. So welcome our panelists. Really excited to have you.
Thank you.
All right, so to kick it off, I wanted to open up the conversation of a couple of things. Number one, obviously introduce your role, but the second part is, I think the most important part is how we're taking a global conversation and we're helping to bring it in and localize it. Because ultimately what we're here to do is we're here to protect people, right? And so, you know, we'll kind of go down the row and let everyone just take maybe 2 minutes and just talk about the globalization of this and taking down to the local level and to the everyday person and what that means.
All right. Hi everyone, I'm Pontus. As Albie said, thank you for inviting us to this panel. So I work for the United Nations, for the part of the United Nations that deals with cities and local governments. It's called UN Habitat. And for the United Nations, human rights is a very important principle. We have three principles: peace, development, and human rights. And increasingly we are seeing that human rights are under threat also in the digital world. The Secretary General of the whole United Nations has 5 main priorities of 2019, and they are things like dealing with peace and security and climate change, and making sure that digital technologies are benefiting everyone. How is this mic? That's
you sound great.
All right. So this really shows the importance that the United Nations is placing on this topic. And the Secretary General this year published a new strategy on dealing with digital technologies. So at UN Habitat, we see that the manifestation of human rights happens very much in cities. 55% of the world's population live in cities, and obviously that's a growing sector. When it comes to digital rights, often cities have the ability to act in a way that national governments cannot. It's at the local level that it's easier to take action. It's less political in a sense. Also we see that many of the digital technologies that are being discussed here are being implemented in cities. Everything from Google doing Street View to services like Airbnb and Uber. And I think it's really time for cities to take action, and cities can take action. And that's why we at UN Habitat are really proud to be supporting the Cities for Digital Rights Coalition, which I'm sure will be discussed a little bit more here. Thank you.
All right, Malcolm.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it working? Is it working here? Yeah? So good afternoon, I'm Malcolm Bain. I'm a lawyer here in Barcelona. No? No. Can I have your microphone? Can I have your microphone? Hello? Yes? Which? Are we good? No? Can you hear me now?
There you
I'll
are.
just speak louder. I'm a lawyer. I'm used to talking louder. Shout at the judges. Okay, so I'm Malcolm Bain. I'm a lawyer here working. I'm focused on digital law mainly, the law of technologies. And for the last 4 years, I've been working with Barcelona City Council on their open technology strategy. Since last year, I'm supporting them in the creation and the operation of the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights. I think that there's two, and I think it's really exciting. I've worked with states and I've worked with companies, and it's much more interesting working with cities because they're actually doing something and they have an interest to pursue there. The open technologies, which is one of the contributions to this, the concept of defending digital rights, is to provide and use technologies over which you have control. So it's been very important, it's been seen as important for cities to take back control over the technologies which are running the cities, running the services, and no longer have such black box, closed proprietary software where they don't really know what's happening and they can't audit what's going on. So this is one of the drives of Barcelona, is to migrate to more open systems where they have greater control. And this was their main contribution to the City Coalition. So I don't know if you've mentioned the Cities Coalition, shall I explain? This is founded by Barcelona, Amsterdam and New York, cities that are very concerned about protecting digital rights in the urban environment. And we have been working on 5 basic principles which come from the United Nations human rights and the Declaration of Human Rights on the Internet. Working on the concepts of digital inclusion and literacy, privacy, non-discrimination and transparency, participation, democratic participation in digital policies, and the 5th one is open technologies. So these are the 5 principles which the cities are working on, taking it down to a practical project level. So with the idea that when new services are being designed, when new projects are being rolled out, the projects should be designed and implemented taking these principles into account. Obviously, I think it's easier in the privacy setting because in Europe, obviously, we've been working with privacy regulations for many years now. But I think there are new ones such as digital democracy and open technologies which need to be worked on. And this is one thing that... So the coalition now has 50 members, or maybe 51, because I think Montreal joined yesterday. And we're on the 5 continents, but only just. And more about that later. Thank you.
Great. All right, Sean, now give us a city perspective.
Hello. Oh, it works. Excellent. Kia ora, my name's Sean. I'm from Wellington in New Zealand, so I'm as far from home as it's possible to get. One of the things that has been occupying us is New Zealand is founded upon a partnership with the native peoples, the Māori. We're very unusual in the settlement countries in that mutual treaty lies at the heart of our constitution and what we do. And when we look at digital identity and digital rights, the ability to define yourself is vital. And the imposition of European ideas of identity rights look quite different from an indigenous point of view. So, for example, in our sort of European tradition, the value of a person is centered upon their individuality, whereas in a Māori context, identity is gained through whakapapa and connection to others. And so we've been putting teams through our GovTech accelerators, working with our native iwi to help define what does whakapapa look like in a digital age and how does that interact with government services. For a city, we've entered an age where the physical and digital worlds are fused together now, and we're in the age of the unconscious internet. So many people don't realize that every time you park your car, every time you make a transaction, you're interacting with that digital world. And with unconsciousness comes a duty of care in the public service, but also the understanding of once something becomes unconscious, it becomes difficult to opt out of. And so one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment is understanding, yes, we've concentrated a great deal on how we get people into the digital world, but what happens if they don't want to be there or they want to leave? And as a city, we're busily trying to find that answer.
Awesome. Mara?
Hi. So at Ideas for Change, we have been working in the past couple of years around the idea of digital identity, mainly because the way we come at it is through data governance. So for the past, I don't know, 10 years, we have been working on different projects where citizens were invited to collect data or to use this data for different things. For example, using sensor technologies or to share this data with the city council to inform policy on pollution. Or, for example, using donating their health data to accelerate research and innovation in healthcare. And obviously, it turns out that when you start working very tangibly with data, you realize that citizens have to be able to govern that data, to manage that data. And especially under GDPR, which is the legislation that we have in Europe, that becomes a must. Now, this started taking us closer to working with these ideas of data governance and data sovereignty. And then we realized that what was really lacking was the infrastructures, social infrastructures, legal infrastructures, and technical infrastructures to really enact data sovereignty for real. And so 2 brief examples that I've been working on for the last past year for you to see what this looks like in practice. The Decode project is one of them. So we were commissioned the organization of the IoT, Internet of Things pilot within the Decode project here in Barcelona. So each citizen participating in this pilot, each citizen participating in the pilot would get a sensor, right? And the pilot would enable citizens to control who could access to the data produced by a sensor, under which conditions, and so on. Now, how do you demonstrate that you are the entity that's legally capable of governing this data? You need to somehow pair your identity onto the sensor and therefore be legally entitled to manage this data. And this obviously took us to the need to develop a sovereign identity that can then be mapped onto this sensor, and then it tells the sensor, okay, I am the legal owner of this data, and therefore I exercise my right. The second example is with Salus. We started a data cooperative 2 years ago because we think that we've been thinking in these concepts around data governance from an individual perspective, say individual identity, individual governance, but some data sets require that we can organize ourselves collectively to agree on how we want to share this data, because this is what's really going to bring power to the people. When we are able to articulate, to galvanize around share sets that and decide together how we want this to share. Think of data. I'll give you an example of the Decode project. I put an environmental sensor in my balcony. That sensor is saying a lot about the behaviors of my neighbor. If he's or she's not at home, if he smokes weed at night, and I can see the particles in the air, etc., etc. So there is this double layer of data governance that requires that we totally rethink what we understand by data governance and also the boundaries of citizenship in the digital area.
Great. All right, Mikko.
Okay, good afternoon. According to our city strategy, Helsinki wants to be the most functional city in the world that makes the best use of digitalization. Digitalization is not a target, but a means of achieving this goal of being most functional city in the world. And here is the challenge. We have over 500 statutory tasks, services we should be providing to our citizens. And on top of that, we have taken approximately 250 voluntary tasks. So it's a massive amount of services. And we have 650,000 citizens living in Helsinki and visitors and own employees. So I claim that we have a massive matching and service discovery problem. So how to make sure that the right services and information finds the right customer, so to say. And we believe in a big paradigm shift. We believe that we as a city should transform from a reactive city to a more proactive city that is serving citizens in a more personalized way. And this is only possible with the help of data and AI. And here is the big question. I mean, how can we have the trust of people of acting this way, using the technology for the benefit of people? And in this coalition, I think we have focused on working on ethical principles on how to use data and AI, because without trust, there is no use for AI. And other big area we are working on is kind of how to increase the understanding of own staff and people about the AI and the kind of risks and ethical issues involved in this. And I need to advertise elements of AI online course that will be made available in all EU languages. That's one free online course that anybody of you can take and get a really good understanding of basics of AI. And now there is a follow-up course we are working on about ethics of AI. But talking about kind of individual rights, we believe that you as an individual have right to your own data. And we are collaborating with the organization called My Data Global. And really the idea is that we should have a capability so that people can decide on their own data and give consent on using their own data. And there is a very practical use case we are considering. If a person is moving from Amsterdam to Helsinki or backwards, what would be the way for an individual, a person to give consent to another city use his or her data? This kind of capabilities do not exist today. And I think this is the kind of direction we should work together. And I think also this comes like as cities, I believe we can impact on the EU legislation and even global legislation on these matters. So that was my short pitch about that.
Love to hear from you, Emily.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Emily and I work for Lyon Métropole, and I'm in charge of smart city in Lyon Métropole. And so we've been following up this large strategy on smart city for the last, let's say, 8 or 10 years. And more recently, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, there was a very strong concern we worked a lot on, of course, on data, on the services we could provide. But the question was how to make also this smart city even more useful and relevant for citizens. And so the first topic we came through is that we need people to understand the digital, the digital transition and the technologies. So one thing that really hit me when I first discovered the Coalition for Digital Rights is that it completely meets also our concern on digital literacy. Because digital literacy doesn't only mean that you know how to fill up a form on the web, but also to really understand what is personal data, as you mentioned, or what is behind the web, or what does it mean to have sensors on one's balcony. And so nowadays, like in digital inclusion and digital literacy is one of our key concerns to make also our smart city more inclusive. And what we can also see is that we really need to scale up on this topic. In France, there have been a lot of studies coming out over the last 2 years, and we estimate like about 13%, 13% of the population never access the internet. 13% of adults in France never access internet. So of course it's a concern as a public authority when we develop our digital services. And more than that, it's about 20% of the population, adult population, that are not at ease with the digital tools. So now we have a big field to work on, and as I said, we really need to scale up on this because, of course, we have a lot of people doing small part of digital inclusion and supporting individuals in their daily life. So what do we need to do on a very local level on this aspect is very simple. Is first we need to train the people. So training the people and improving their literacy means to act very locally. And for that, it means that we need really local actors at a neighborhood scale, working with local association, but working also with local public offices for public services, and to keep them open for individual support on. So it's when digital literacy becomes very physical and individual, in fact. And then another key challenge also on this aspect is to train the professional, and to train the professional on social welfare, because they are the people on direct contact with the population on a daily basis. And even these people, they do accompany and they do support the individuals in their daily life on digital inclusion, but they're not trained for that. And they also need specific competencies on not only, again, on the forms online or on the different procedures for social welfare, but also on how do I handle the personal data of the person I support? What do I do if I have all the access codes of one person? So that's one of the key questions. And so training the professional is another big challenge for us.
So I think we just had one big infomercial on the Cities for Digital Rights Principles. So, I mean, basically we touched on all of my favorite parts. So we talked about digital literacy, digital identity, the importance of opting into data and data sovereignty. We talked about the importance of recognizing culture as part of a digital right. We talked about legal frameworks and the importance of having like an overarching support for this. So I want to use a couple of minutes, and so this anyone can answer this, and I think that I have probably the best panel to do that. But maybe what are very quickly, a couple of specific actions that, whether you're a city or an organization, that you can take to protect residents' privacy and security when participating in the digital realm? And I'll take answers from anyone on the panel.
Well, I think GDPR, I mean EU privacy laws is a good starting point, and setting requirements for all players in European Union on how privacy-related data is handled. And like in Helsinki, as I mentioned, I find very important that we are working on building these My Data capabilities. And in practice, it means that we need to make sure that we have capabilities for importing and exporting data, and also kind of consent management platform and a profile to which we can attach individual preferences and consents. So people have technical ways of seeing all the information or data that has been stored, and also review the consents that have been given in the past, and also permission to revoke those permissions. I mentioned that we want to be more proactive and personalized in serving our residents, but that should be like optional. If you are not willing to get any proposals from the city, you should not get those. It would only mean that then you have to rely on, let's say, more traditional ways of dealing with the city. So I think these My Data principles are very important in my list.
And I think that spoke a little bit to the digital literacy component as well, but I know, Mara, you had something that you wanted to add?
Well, I mean, I think that it's okay to focus on cities and what cities can do, as cities can really be the custodian of the infrastructures that allow data sovereignty. But here the problem is that we don't have a viable alternative to surveillance capitalism. I mean, like, we need to find business models for companies that are data intensive, so that they can deliver digital services that are useful for citizens, for cities, that do not put people's privacy and security at risk. And public procurement is a great instrument to create an opportunity create an opportunity for companies to invite companies to be able to be a bit more creative when it comes to the business models that they put forward. We need a public, private, and citizen-led ecosystem that allows us to advance to move towards a new frontier of data and digitalization that doesn't put people's privacy at stake. And this needs to be done somehow, and it's not only through public policy, but also through the businesses.
So it sounds like you're talking a little bit about collaboration between different entities in order to come to an agreement on what some of these things are that we're requiring for our citizens. Love to hear some thoughts in terms of some collaborations that have happened either through the city's Coalition for Digital Rights, which Plug a year ago this month was launched between different cities, and it's growing. But I think that speaks a lot to the power of collaboration and how cities are talking with each other, academia, civil society. Like, what are some great examples of how that's happening today?
I can add some examples on it's both on your two interventions, because we are part also of My Data and also like a national equivalent on Mes Infos, so it's on self data. And so the objective is exactly what you say, is how do we reverse also the principles on personal data? And the principle of this personal data project is to build local, personal and secured infrastructure for personal data, where I can store, I can collect, store, and visualize also all my personal data, so that each citizen can also handle their personal data for their personal use, and so that the services, I don't need to deliver my data to access the service, but the services themselves that come and question my personal space and to access the service. So that's exactly what you say. We reverse the tenants and the business models also, so that I don't need to deliver all my personal data to access to such and such services. But it's the service itself that come and question my personal space without having access directly to the data, and to deliver the service.
So one of the key things we do as a city is differentiate between a person and a customer. So we are an agency of place. We don't actually need to know a lot about people to do our job. We need to know that somebody walked down the street. We do not need to know who that is. So using a privacy by design process, we essentially minimize the collection of data, so that if you don't hold data, you don't need to secure it. There's nothing to protect. But the key thing that we're finding now is understanding the geography of social license, because what you can do in a central city street is different to a residential area, to a park. And that starts to get into one of the most thorny problems we have, which is how do you maintain consent in a constantly evolving environment? You constantly have pressures to customize environments for people, but as you do a little bit more and a little bit more, how do you maintain that consent and take those people with you and allow them to begin to say, this is the direction we wish to go, this is the limit of my consent, and this is when you need to talk to me about renewing that mandate?
Great. Pontus, I think you had something to add, and then we'll go with.
Thanks. No, I want to say that I think that individual data and privacy is absolutely fundamental, of course, but I would also like to make a case for cities taking control of what could be considered their own data. If taxi companies are driving on the streets that were funded by the city and collecting data, perhaps some of that data should belong to the city. And I think there are some interesting collaborative models that could be done here. There's also some regulation. I'm thinking about what Barcelona have done, for example, with Airbnb. There is a law in the city that says that you cannot rent out your apartment on Airbnb unless you have a tourism license. Of course, it's very intensive for the city, or resource intensive for the city to check that. So they convinced Airbnb to open up an API where they could connect the registry of apartments with a tourism license directly with apartments that are being rented on Airbnb. That's the kind of thing that could happen. And it's partly regulation, but it's also convincing some of these companies to actually collaborate in a positive way for everyone.
Yeah. So I think that's a good example of some policy and legal frameworks. And speaking of legal, I'd love to hear from our lawyer, Malcolm.
I was going to mention that also. There's also the decree on all the new shared, motorcycle sharing. All these operators for sharing the different local mobility solutions, they have to share data with the city so the city can understand the different mobility within the city. I think also one of the great things of the city coalition is the concept of coalition and the working together of different cities with different objectives. But for example, on yesterday we had our meeting looking for the action plan for 2020, and I think one of the greatest ideas that came out of yesterday's session was a concept of a digital rights impact assessment. So cities are very useful to doing environmental impact assessments, other forms of impact assessment. So why not work together for a common model, or at least a usable model that's in whenever you have a new service or when you have a new infrastructure or whatever the city is investing in, do a digital rights impact assessment based on the 5 principles of the coalition. And obviously the top one probably will, as you're saying, is privacy, security. And do we actually, do we need the data? When we're talking with the city, they say, yes, we want to know more and more about our citizens because we want to be proactively offering them services that they may not even know that they're entitled to. So that there is a balance there between, having too much data, not having enough data. And I think through the internal policies with tools like impact assessments, that they can try and find that balance.
Great. So unfortunately, we're all out of time, and so there won't be an opportunity to take any questions from the audience, but I think that if everyone's gracious enough to stick around and maybe answer some questions, but I think that the theme here is really that it's through different conversations and having everyone at the table and really bringing this topic top of mind. I mean, I think the technology conversation has been happening for a really long time, but there's a lot of things to reconcile for, and that really only happens with having different groups with different interests at the table having that discussion. But ultimately, we're here for people, right? And we're here for residents, and if not for people, then who are we doing this for? And I think that that's probably a message that we can all take with us, is that number one is that, people first, and that's who we're really thinking about when we're serving as cities or organizations or civil society. But the second thing is through collaboration is when we achieve greater results. And I think the other thing is, for me, as a person that participates in the city, it makes me feel safe, and it makes me feel like there are some really great people working in or with cities to ensure that we are doing right by residents. And so I want to not just thank you for being on this panel, but thank you for the work that you're doing in cities. And so let's give our panelists a hand for joining us today. Thank you.